On the Track is a monthly web TV show about cryptozoology, natural history, green issues and whatever else the team feel like making up as they go along. Enjoy!
I suspect that some of you may have seen this already, but if you haven't, I hope you enjoy it, and if you have, I hope it bears repeating.
Welcome back, it's me with the show you want to see about cryptozoology. Come inside, come inside. There behind that fox is Richard Freeman in a box with some Tories that he mocks. Come inside, come inside. Come inside and listen unto me. We broadcast on Saturdays at 3. Hard times, weird shit, so reality. And I stole this song from the LP. Come see the show. It's 40 and you know. Come see the show. It's rock and roll.
I've been doing this show for many years, but since we stopped doing the Weird Weekend, I've missed so much about it, so we decided to combine what's best about the Weird Weekend with the new iteration of the show.
Come see the show. The Comedy Rhino and Computer Boy. Producers it, you know.
At the CFZ, we're both big and clever.
For those of you who are not aware of the minutiae of 1970s progressive rock music, or who, like Louis, are not born until several decades later, the music that I so cheerfully lampooned in that song was by Emerson, Lake and Palmer from the album Brain Salad Surgery, and it's called Carnival 9 Part 1 Second Impression. You try and say that when you've been drinking. I haven't been drinking, but it's hard enough to say it and get it right. It took me something like 6 goes, and this is going to be the last one, whether or not it is right. On with the show.
I really like the old credits.
One of the most common stories in books on cryptozoology is that of Zana, the wild woman. She was captured in Abkhazia, which is now modern-day Georgia, back in the 1870s and spent something like 2 decades as a captive. She was allegedly covered in hair, freakishly strong, and very tall, which has always made me wonder how easy it was to capture her in the first place, but that's another story. She spent 2 decades doing menial tasks and regularly being gotten drunk by various of the local men who then had sex with her, and she fathered a whole string of babies, most of whom died, until the locals had the idea of taking the babies away from her before she could wash them in the local river. Recently, the story of Zana has been turned on its head with the publication of a fascinating new genetic investigation into her remains. A week or so ago, Richard Freeman, Carl Marshall and I sat down to debate the matter. Okay, Richard.
Well, Tom Gilbert, who is geneticist from Copenhagen University, friend of Lars Thomas, who's a member of the CFZ. He's done stuff for us before, and he seems to be a good bloke, and I trust his work. And he's examined the DNA of Khwit and Zana, and Khwit is definitely Zana's son, and Zana is not some form of hominin, but she's a modern day human being from Africa, most closely related to the Dinka people. So if she is a modern day human being, then she has got a suite of really bizarre characteristics. She's massively tall, she's very hairy, she has an ape-like face, she can't speak, she's inarticulate, and she's monstrously strong. So the chances of all of those characteristics being in one person is not very good at all. It's very low. And even if one person was unlucky enough to have all those things wrong with them, to give them this appearance of what I call a pseudo Almasty, you wouldn't get a whole race of people like that. So you can't explain the whole of the Almasty phenomenon on African slaves living feral in the Caucasus Mountains and other areas. It just doesn't work.
I'm not so sure that they are as hairy as is being let on. I mean, we know that she had dark skin, and she would have had a very different appearance to anybody else in that area. Is it possible that she wasn't hairy at all, and it was just a symbol of savagery that had been attached to her?
Well, you do get things like that, because our guide in Sumatra, Sahar Dimus, who is one of the modern day Sumatrans who are all coming from Malaya, they don't like the Kubu people, who are the natives, the Negrito people, who are the natives of Sumatra, who were there thousands of years before them. And I remember years ago him saying, oh well, they're dirty, they have tails like monkeys, and you know, sort of making them less than human. So it could be something like that. The whole story of Zana being this giant hairy wild woman might be complete nonsense, and she was just maybe a mentally retarded person that was kept as a slave on this farm. It would be interesting to get hold of Tom Gilbert and ask him if he did any measurements of the skeleton and the skull to see how tall she was, because she was supposed to be 6'7", 6'7", 6'9",
Yeah.
something like that, which is way beyond the parameters of what's average.
Yeah. Might be a case of exaggeration, possibly.
But the Almasty witnesses that I've spoken to, which include a doctor of geology who was the Tahir, his name was, and he was the deputy head of Albrus National Park. He saw one of these things, and he described it. He saw it from the back, walking up a hill, and he described it as having this great domed head with a sagittal crest and massively muscular, these long arms and hair. It couldn't have been a modern human being.
No.
It's something else.
Yeah.
And all the other witnesses were describing these ape-like faces, mostly with pale skin. I remember one guy who said he was left food out for a young one that came to his backyard. Him and his wife both saw it, and she said he said its hand, it had skin on it like a white man's hand. It was pale like ours, and when it was grabbing the bread, he got a good look at the hand, and its fully articulate thumb, opposable thumb, and it looked like a human hand but much hairier, and the creature itself was all covered with hair.
Well, that's quite different to Zana, isn't it?
What do you think that this latest revelation has done to Dr. Bryan Sykes' claims?
Well, Bryan Sykes, before he died, said he was working with another geneticist. He said a numeric geneticist on the DNA of Zana. Now that geneticist must have been Tom Gilbert, because I wrote to him asking me for information on this other geneticist. He never wrote back because, you know, he was dying. So it left it as a bit of a mystery, but now it seems like he was working with Tom. So basically, after decades and decades of these stories, we've put to bed a red herring.
Yeah, and that can only be a good thing.
Mm.
Now we can pinpoint the real Almasty, surely.
Yeah.
What about the suggestions that Dr. Bryan Sykes made about Zana possibly coming from some ancestral African lineage?
Well, Bryan Sykes, when he was talking to me, said he thought that the genetics was pointing towards a pre-Homo sapien ancestry for Zana. And he reckoned it was some unknown form of hominin that had arisen in, he said, West Africa rather than East Africa, and then migrated out. So why he thought that, and you know how Tom has disproved this, I don't know. I'm not a geneticist. I couldn't tell you why he thought that, but he did.
I think it'd be a jolly good idea if we contacted Tom Gilbert and see if he fancies coming on the show to talk about this.
Yeah, sure. Well, I was thinking of asking Lars something similar. Well, I was thinking of asking Lars, you know, to ask him some questions about, you know, whether he measured the skeleton. And
yeah, that'd be a really good start, just to know whether or not she was as tall as is suggested. I wouldn't be surprised if she wasn't.
No, neither would I.
You were saying something very interesting the other day, Carl, about the way that Almasty are reported to sleep.
Yeah, that position, which is sort of crouched down on the floor with your hands behind your neck sort of thing, looking down at the ground, that doesn't seem like the kind of position a bipedal animal would sleep in to me. And it seems much more like how a slave being mistreated might be forced to stay outside in that kind of position as a sort of punishment maybe. But I just don't think that that's very viable for a hominin to be sleeping in that position.
It looks to me as if it is somebody who is suffering from a serious trauma disorder like PTSD. But remember, I haven't been a nurse for well over 30 years now. But back when I was a nurse, I've known people who slept just like that.
They were actually being forced to stay in that position all night. You know, people did all sorts of awful things to slaves. You know, locking them in metal boxes and, you know, all sorts of things. So he used to say that they weren't just forced outside in the cold. And they were trying to keep warm and they just had to keep their head down.
The stories of Zana also say that she refused to come inside into the warm.
Yeah, that makes no sense. I would say it's much more likely she had no choice.
Now there is other stories of Almasties, like the one that the doctor examined. There was a doctor who examined an Almasty that had been captured by the army.
It was a male, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a big male Almasty, and he came to the conclusion he was some form of wild man, he wasn't human. But they said about him, if he's put in a heated room, he sweats profusely, he can't stand it.
So why were they saying the same things about Zana when we know that Zana was just a modern human? And of African descent too.
Yeah, so you think she'd be more vulnerable to that?
You would think so, yeah.
Everybody is jumping to the conclusion that Zana was a recently escaped slave. But what if she was the descendant of escaped slaves? Because we do know that the Ottoman slave trade from East Africa had gone on for many centuries, and she could have been the descendant of slaves who escaped 500 years before and had been living ferally, and I'm sure feral is the wrong word when applied to humans, but I can't think of a better term, and please, if there's somebody who can tell me this, please tell me in the comments below, but who had been living ferally in the forests and mountains of the Corsicas.
So she would have adapted in that time, I suppose.
But she seemed to be mentally subnormal. she couldn't speak.
That's another thing I always wondered.
Yeah.
Could she really not speak, or could she just not speak the dialect of the locals?
But she didn't seem to communicate very well either. I mean, if you read the descriptions about her, she seemed not able to form words or certain things.
But she knew what some words meant, though, didn't she? Because she would respond to them, and she did do the job.
Well, she was taught to do menial jobs around the farm.
So she must have understood some words, or she wouldn't have been able to do that.
But the mental state she seemed to be in doesn't seem to be that of a normal human being.
It makes no sense at all that she would prefer to sleep outside in a hole that she'd dug. It seems to me that she would be more. It would be more likely that she was forced into that position and she was just making do.
And that the people who were responsible imbued her with all these bestial characteristics in order to assuage their own guilt for basically keeping a mentally handicapped black woman as a sex slave for 2 decades.
Yeah, exactly.
You were thinking that the stories of her trying to wash her children in the river and they dying of the cold. She was actually drowning.
Yeah, I thought maybe she was actually drowning them, so they wouldn't have to live the same kind of life she was living. I can't think of any other explanation for that because she wasn't an Almasty, and we know that.
That's also, I think we've got to keep in mind is that one pseudo Almasty doesn't mean there's no such thing as the real Almasty. It's like saying that if a painting thought to be by Picasso is found out to be a fake, then there's no such thing as Picasso.
Yeah. In fact, we could use this, couldn't we, to pinpoint the real thing now?
And it's also, to carry your analogy on and go to another one of Bryan Sykes' discoveries, it's like the people who, when Bryan Sykes produced perfectly cogent evidence that there is probably a new species, or at least a new type of bear in the Himalayas, and the papers all said, oh, the Yetis disproved it's only a bear. It's irrelevant.
So from what I gather, the Dramo has always been considered a bear, hasn't it?
Yeah.
It's a bit like saying, Carl's wearing a hat, Richard's not wearing a hat, which means, therefore, that Richard doesn't own a hat and never wears a hat. I think that's what they call a logical fallacy.
Yeah.
Bears have dog-like muzzles, they have prominent ears on their heads, they have narrow shoulders when they stand erect because their scapula's face down like a dog's rather than outwards like a biped's. They don't have opposable thumbs for hurling rocks and swinging clubs, and they don't look like upright gorillas. So the Yeti and the Himalayan brown bear or whatever type of bear it is are two completely different things. The Yeti walks erect all of the time. The bear just stands erect as a threat posture. And the confusing thing is the term zute, which is used for the larger type of Yeti, the 8 to 10 foot tall one. It's also used for the very big brown bears, and it simply means hulking thing or big thing. And so it's
not very specific, is it?
No, it's a term used for both of them.
I think that one of the most consistently reported features is the broad shoulders and no visible neck. Now that does not sound like a bear to me. Like you said, the scapula of a bear is a different shape completely, and bears have got a very long kind of neck. It's sort of, the head's really high, isn't it, above the shoulders? And that is never ever reported in hominins.
No. And on the subject of mysterious hominin DNA, there's the other case of Dr. Eva Bellarmine, who was a French geneticist, and she went with the British vet Mark Evans to Bhutan in 2018 and they got environmental DNA from a pool in which animals had been drinking in the mountains of Bhutan. And they found that when they looked at it, there was a very rare form of very large wild sheep that was unknown from the area until then. It obviously lives there because it had been drinking in the pool. And they also got DNA from a primate, which they said shared 98% of its genetic makeup with human beings. So it meant it's as closely related to human beings as a gorilla. It doesn't mean that it is a gorilla, just that it is as closely related to human beings as a gorilla is.
Mm-hmm.
And I tracked her down and wrote to her and said she couldn't do any more work on it because she couldn't afford to do any more work on it, and she didn't work for the company that still had it, called SpyGen, which sounds like something out of a James Bond novel. So I got my French friend, the filmmaker Christopher Killian, and he wrote to SpyGen saying, can we get hold of this supposed Yeti DNA to do more work on it, because we've got geneticists here who can do this for us. We want to know what this is. And they said, we can't give it to you because it's not ours to give. We don't own it, so we can't give it to you. To which he wrote back saying, well, can you put us in touch with the people who legally own it? Because, as I say, we have geneticists waiting to work on it. And then they said, we can't give it to you now because it's been destroyed. The sample's been destroyed. Why the hell would they destroy the sample?
Well, that makes no sense. Unless, of course, they'd used it all up.
They said they destroyed it. That was their word.
Which sounds to me like a off-pat response to get rid of annoying
But
questions.
don't you think that they've got this DNA which, if it shares 98% of its genetic makeup with human DNA, then it's some sort of ape. There are no apes known from the Himalayas. The nearest ones are orangutans in Borneo and Sumatra. The only zoo in Bhutan is a zoo for the captive breed Tarkin. They've got no primates there at all. So there are no captive apes in Bhutan.
Where are the nearest gibbons?
The nearest gibbons to Bhutan would be in India. The nearest gibbons would be in India. But they wouldn't be as genetically close.
And nowhere near as north.
No. And so, you would think that the potential of a new species of ape living in Bhutan would be dynamite. You'd think they'd be all over it.
Mm.
Why not? Why is this sample being destroyed?
Yes, very suspicious.
Is it just incompetence? Laziness?
Well, we need to find out first whether or not they've just used the sample up completely.
Mm.
I mean, there's only so much of a hair, isn't it? You can keep cutting it up so many times.
This was in water. This was taken from water. It was a
Oh,
water
it's
sample.
eDNA?
It was environmental DNA from this pool. Like I was telling you about, things have been drinking from it. And they
Okay, yeah.
yeah. So they've got a jar of the stuff.
Which they've now tipped on the drain.
So, skeptics keep asking, show us the evidence, show us the evidence. We get the evidence and it gets destroyed.
And that was about it. I make no apologies for having taken up the whole of this show with one topic, but this is the most important bombshell to hit cryptozoology for many a year, and I wanted to do it justice. Indeed, we haven't yet done so. We're going to try and get in touch with Tom Gilbert and several other people to do with the case and do some more interviews and find out some more of the details which I know that you, like us, want to know before we can work out where to go next on the thorny topic of hominin research in the Caucasus.
If you want to support us and help us make more content like these, please press like, subscribe, follow our Facebook page and check out our Patreon.
And as the ghost of Joe Strummer and I are telling you, please remember to ring that notification bell. Otherwise you won't be told when we've got another show. But never fear, you only have to wait another 7 days and I'll be back with you, because every Saturday afternoon is On the Track time. I'm going to be there, and if you're going to be there, I'll be seeing you.